Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today's episode, we're going to talk about the pressure to conform. And as we've been mulling this over between the three of us for some time, there's so many dimensions with which this is significant. The way in which families can force us to conform, the way our religious groups can force us to conform, and in mythology, we find many examples and fairy tales of the struggle between conformity and following one's own path. And another area we'll be sure to cover is when is rejecting conformity or rebelling against conformity in service to the self, to individuation, and when is it just a form of being precious and stirring up trouble?
Yeah, or attention-seeking, or lots of other things.
In some other way defensive.
Yeah,
instead of really in the service of one's own developmental arc.
And I feel like I want to sort of plant a stake in one side of the argument here, that it's pretty easy to go to a kind of sentimental place about this, like, oh, it's really good to strike out on your own and go your own way, and that's always virtuous. But of course, everything in the psyche has two sides. And the thing about pressures to conform is that conformity serves us. It serves the collective, and it often serves the individual. I mean, conformity is what helps us establish an orderly collective life. And it helps us find our path, maybe, when we don't know what that path should be. I mean, I think there's real value in sticking with what has worked for those who have gone before. So when our families want us to go to college, we may chafe against that and think, I want to be a rugged individualist and do my own thing. And I mean, sometimes that's the right thing to do, but I don't think we should assume it is out of hand. There is a value in doing the thing that's always been done. There can be a value in conforming. So again, as with everything else, it's a question of discernment and how we hold it and how conscious is it.
And I think this adaptation to the culture is not inherently wrong. And Jung made an important differentiation between the self and the ego and the persona. And the persona complex ideally would allow some of our authentic needs to be present in the social environment, but also to absorb adaptive social norms so that we're not always exhausting ourselves, struggling against cultural expectations, but we can weave between the lines to make sure that ideally we're still being ourselves at root.
You know, that brings to mind this great phrase of Freud's, a compromise with reality. Mm-hmm. You know, that we have our heart's desire maybe, or what the soul wants of us. And then there's the real world that we live in. And we have to make a compromise with reality. And more than often than not, that's going to require some conformity.
Or rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
Mm-hmm. So the Latin root of the word conform is conformare, which means to shape or to modify, to fashion. And so when we allow an aspect of our behavior to be shaped or modified by cultural norms, there can be some value to that. But where we can get into trouble is when those social norms reach in below the persona and start to change what we essentially are, and we begin to violate who we know ourselves to be in order to fit in.
Yeah, I think about it a little bit differently. It's sort of like the individual is always going to chafe against the collective expectations. There's always going to be some kind of conflict there. And that has to be managed in one way or another. And sometimes you can just sort of put up with it. And sometimes you might just have to buckle under it. And sometimes it's the right thing to stand up and say, here's where I need to make a decisive break from that which the collective expects of me.
So let's bring up something that is, I think, very relevant, is being gay. So down in the South, a young man is gay, And there is an absolute pressure for him to get married and to have children and to not in any way signal any deviation from that and to risk enormous social repercussions.
And Joseph, I'm just going to call you out here for a second because I know that you have your practice south of the Mason-Dixon line and you spend time down there. And I'm just going to challenge you a little bit. Is that a bit of a stereotype about the South, or do you really find that?
I would say the number of married men with children who are having active homosexual lives
Wow.
because the culture made no place for them to safely own their identity until they reach a breaking point. So that still happens in the United States. I mean, we can make all kinds of comments or judgments about that, but I have to say that when you're raised in a culture and still are raised in a culture where it is terrifying to be yourself, your sexual identity, and the pressure from infancy, by the way, to adopt a heteronormative lifestyle, there's a cost to be paid for that in the culture.
Yeah.
So these same people who are insisting that every boy be heteronormative, well, you better watch out because that guy's going to marry your daughter. And when he turns out to be gay, there's going to be a lot of heartache.
Yeah.
And your inflexibility about making space for gay culture is the cause of that heartbreak. That's a general kind of topic, but I think it is still widely present in the United States and is widely present in other cultures around the world.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about the pressure to conform and that the punishment for that is exile. So we say the person is criticized or bullied or all kinds of things, but it relates, I think, to the archetype of exile, that you cannot be part of our group. You are being rejected. You have to live in some kind of psychological wilderness by yourself.
Which, of course, brings us back to the episode we did a number of weeks ago now on the scapegoat.
And that we are social beings, and it is very hard for us to live on our own. I mean, eons ago, a human being could not have survived, literally survived, without being part of a community, without being part of a tribe. Just individual existence, what really was not possible. And I think psychologically very much the same remains true. And it can be the cost of standing for oneself, of who one really is and what one's values truly deeply are. The price can be very high.
And one of the ways when we talk about the pressure to conform is when you have an individual, I'm going to continue to use this example of being gay, when you have a young gay boy who's watching his father, his mother, and his brothers target, scapegoat, harass, or demean other gay people in the community, that creates an enormous pressure for that boy to alienate himself or to go through whatever kinds of suppressive or repressive strategies that are available to make sure that he does not suffer that fate. And that is one of the ways that the culture communicates, is watching how people are treated who have the traits that the child or the individual holds secretly inside themselves. And that's very effective. Makes them want to conform.
There are also issues and subjects, values that are not quite as loaded as whether one is heteronormative or not in a culture that does or doesn't validate it. There are really, seemingly smaller things like being a daughter-in-law or a mother-in-law, how we do our holidays, what our family customs are. We always have this for Christmas dinner. We always open the gifts on Christmas Eve. Or no, we never open the gifts on Christmas Eve. And those pressures to be like us in these small ways of what we eat, how we do holidays, who's in charge, all of that kind of thing can be also a huge pressure to conform in order to feel like you belong, in order to feel approved of.
But we're talking about in terms of when that interferes with individuation, the pressure to conform in ways that the self doesn't care about, whether or not we're a family that doesn't eat pork or we only eat beef. it's unlikely that the self is going to rally against that or feel violated
I
by
disagree.
the norms of that.
I
don't
absolutely
know.
disagree. With family pressures to be like we are, to be the same, I think is all those little things can add up in tremendous ways.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of tracking that you guys are on slightly different roads here, and I guess I have something to say about both. So let me see if I can kind of do that, and then maybe we can pick one way to go or the other. But I think, Deb, what you're talking about is a sort of enmeshed family where there's a real demand that you adopt a certain family culture, and if you don't, you risk being ostracized. And so it can just feel very stifling. It may not rise to the same level of real anguish that Joseph is talking about.
Not only can it feel stifling, but my reference to the archetype of exile is also there.
Yes, yeah,
that if you do not do things the way we do it, you will not really belong.
And, I mean, I have so many people in my practice that are trying to negotiate these family relationships, either with their own family of origin or with in-law families, where these little things just take on a huge amount of meaning and are just freighted with all this significance. And, if you don't, send the right thank you note or the right holiday card or something, you do run the risk of being exiled, and it can feel very constraining. But Joseph, on your example, I want to bring the other side. I want to do that thing about kind of holding the tension of the opposites. That let's imagine a different kind of conformity that might be helpful. You're braising one, which is so damaging. And I'm reminded of the research, a fairly recent vintage that looked at as gay marriage was ratified in different states, you could actually see the suicide rate for gay and lesbian youth decrease in states as they adopted gay marriage in the state, which I find, just such a kind of stunning ratification of how important it is that this be publicly accepted. But let's look at something else for just a second. What about the pressure to conform in terms of, hey, when you get to be about 22 or 23, it's time for you to get the heck out of the house and get a job. I mean, that is a certain kind of social pressure. And I think that that's positive. That sort of kindles a heroic attitude and it gets you out. And, I know of young people who sort of have the attitude, well, I'm my own person. I don't need to meet these collective expectations. And, they're sort of proverbially living in their parents' basement. So again, some of these collective expectations can be in the service of, say, ego development.
Yeah, I think that expecting the ego to be adaptive in ways that do not violate the core sense of being is absolutely an important part of growing and actualizing life skills.
And I just want to point out that some people feel like you're violating their core sense of being if you expect them to get a job.
Well, and I actually have worked with homeless populations and have met that. And that there are certain personality types who feel that living on the street keeps them free of expectations, of burdens. They're kind of living in this perpetual camping and foraging kind of environment. And until they get sick or injured, there is something that is incredibly freeing about it. And I'll tell you just a brief story. So a friend of mine, this is probably a couple of years ago, came by and said that she had been walking through our metropolitan area and had seen a homeless person on the street, and there was just some kind of feeling of connection with the person. Sat down and had a long conversation with them right there, and found out that the person was an artist. And so the person said, listen, for a little bit of money, maybe it was $200, I'll make you a piece of art. And so she's very open-hearted, but she's a very savvy person. She thought, I'm just going to trust my heart. I'm going to give this guy $200. And, if he just runs off and buys himself a coat, it's okay. It's going to be okay. comes back about a week later, and the guy has a painting. Not only does he have a painting, but it's a great painting.
Oh my gosh.
It's like an inspiring painting.
Wow.
So she's thrilled. He's making a little bit of money. And so she comes and tells all of us, shows us a picture of the painting. It's really lovely. It's a little bit like an icon. And very, very moving, these soulful, expressive eyes. And so she said, it would be great if all of us, this little group of friends, if we all just really decided we're going to do this. We're just going to go and give this guy some money and have him do a little bit of art for all of us. So, 7 or 8 of us decided that we'd go, we'd cough up a couple $100, talk to him for a minute and have him do some paintings. People are watching him because he's doing the paintings on the street. A local coffee house says, listen, if you'll paint in public, in the coffee house, we'll just give you a place to store your artwork. Then you can come and we'll set you up in a corner and you can paint and people will just have coffee and it'll just add to this kind of atmosphere. So all this happens in about 2 months. About 4 months later, he's gone. That the pressure of having people notice him, the pressure for him to continue to negotiate around money and productivity and not be able to kind of live on the wind as his psyche required, that there was a certain point where he simply just abandoned the area and none of us ever saw him again.
Yeah, so he either couldn't or wouldn't conform to collective norms. Just couldn't do it.
And was there something just innate in his personality, which of course made him highly eccentric based on most standards, that simply said that I can't adjust to this. And yet there was something very valuable about the person.
And I think what I'm lifting up is particularly when this kind of attitude comes about in young adulthood, that I'm so special and I'm so different that I don't need to conform to collective norms, that's a real inflation. To differentiate oneself, that's more a task for the second half of life. And if you're really stuck at 23, if you're just really adamant that I'm really special and I don't need to do what other people need to do, that's probably, you're probably in the territory of a dangerous inflation. So I'm just lifting up this other side.
I want to write on that. I think you're right, Lisa. I think that it really has to do with stages of life. And the first half of life, this ego does have to sacrifice some of its intrinsic identity to actually take a foothold in the culture.
Yeah, I'm thinking too that differentiation, the way that I understand Jung meaning it, is really a developmental step forward rather than a retreat from life of I can't. That is not differentiating. That is maybe a defense or a surrender.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
It is not meeting the challenge. And I'm not in any way judging this man about whom you just told the story. But I think that's a crucial kind of litmus test. Is this person making a developmental step to meet a challenge and relate to his own inner core, the self? Or is the person simply using an escape hatch, so to put it in a very colloquial way? And there are people that simply can't meet the norms. They can't meet the demands. Their level of anxiety is very high. They can't tolerate stress, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not sure I would call that differentiating.
Well, I would say that we don't know.
I agree.
Because a lot of very famous artists fail to accommodate the cultural norms, Van Gogh being one of many.
But the one thing I would say, I think you're sort of both right, and the way I would marry that is that for most of us are ordinary. Most of us are ordinary. And if we're ordinary, then we ought to kind of accommodate ourselves more or less to doing the ordinary thing. Our version of it. I'm not saying there isn't room for individualism, but it's the extraordinary person who really is going to live wildly outside of cultural norms and be successful in that way.
And there is a middle ground. And I think of the story of Jung when he was having his creative crisis and found that he was experiencing enormous demands from his inner life, some of which came from the self, some of which came from other parts of his psyche. And he kind of cut a deal and said, the first half of the day, I'm going to devote to doing anything the unconscious wants. I'll go to the shore, there's a lake, I'll make little castles, I'll draw, I'll carve stones, whatever you want, I'll do it. And then I'm going to go home for lunch, I'm going to take a shower, and then I'm going to see clients for the rest of the day, and then I'm going to give a lecture at night.
Yeah.
And so there really is this middle ground where we can have part of the life that is profoundly dedicated to the self and to the psyche in its largeness, and then also force ourselves to have enough ego strength to adapt to what's required to survive.
Yeah, that is a nice
in the world.
example, that you have to sort of find a space for both most of the time.
So actually, I think Joseph and Lisa, we're talking, you and I, Joseph, about two different things. I think you're talking about the intrapsychic relationship, the relationship between self, ego and the unconscious, or the ego and the self with a capital S, of being true to one's true nature, in your example of a young man who's gay and really has to answer the call to be in accordance with his own deep, true nature. I'm interested, and I'm talking about the relationship with other people, with families, maybe a family of in-laws whose customs are very different or whose values are very different, or the larger collective. And I think both of those are absolutely valid, but they're different.
Yeah, and they do cross.
They
right?
dance with each other
They
because
do
it's
cross.
through family norms that children come to ideas of what the norms are and realize whether or not they're going to be allowed to blossom within those norms.
I often think of it as literally a cross, that the interpersonal axis is horizontal and the intrapsychic axis, or the relationship between you and you, is vertical. And they do cross, they intersect, and they're different processes as well. And it's important. I think we can't always know for sure, where some of this differentiation is coming from. Is it a defense? Is it a failure to launch or to meet developmental challenges? Is it a call to answer a need to be true to one's own self? Am I just protesting social values for the sake of seeking attention or being difficult? Where is it, as we say colloquial, where is it coming from?
Mm-hmm.
And so within your conversation about relationships and family dynamics, how do you evaluate what pressures to conform are reasonable to expect an accommodation, and when do you identify that is doing violence to an individual in the system?
I want to sort of just reframe how we're even thinking about that question, because who was it that said that writing poetry doesn't rhyme is like playing tennis without a net? Was that Robert Frost? That may have been Robert Frost. But there is a way that we come into being through sort of chafing against these expectations. And we have to negotiate them and figure out which ones we're going to say, okay, you know what? I mean, I remember for like a hot second when I was in I guess I was in 10th grade, I was like, I'm not going to go to college. I think we were reading Walden. And I was like, I'm going to go live in the wilderness. And,
by the pond in the middle of the town of Concord, Massachusetts.
Yeah. And eventually, I think my parents were like, okay, and then like 2 weeks later, I was like, no, maybe college is actually a good idea. But it's sort of negotiating all of these points. And like, yeah, I think I'll sort of follow the prescription to go to college. Maybe that's not such a bad idea. But come to think of it, my father very, very, very much wanted me to study business. And I just didn't, it wasn't even that I mounted a protest. I just knew it was something I couldn't do,
And what did you have to go through to hear your father, to feel his expectations, and to reject them?
What did I have to go through? I mean, it was pretty uncomfortable. And it wasn't altogether entirely conscious.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a real profound feeling of this sort of, I can't, I have to do what I know I need to do.
Right. So dropping down to that voice of I can't, and imagining the speaker of that, or how the I can't-ness became apparent to you. What I would submit is that as your father said, oh, go into business, be an accountant. As a bright kid, you're imagining what the life of an accountant would be. And as you held that image in your psyche, that you experienced some amount of distress or pain or aversion to actually having
just
that life.
Sort of no energy at all for that.
Right. Absolutely.
There was just no libido for it. And a certain amount of hurt that this would be sort of expected of me when it seemed so very different from where my interests and aspirations lay.
Right. It felt, I would imagine, that you were being colonized with something that was deeply alien. And that to imagine that your parents would know you so poorly that they would expect you to enjoy being colonized by that idea.
Yes.
I mean, it's sobering. It's like, wow, do you even know who I am that you would suggest that I become an accountant? And that's a growing up moment.
Yeah.
Because I think kids have this feeling that their parents can have X-ray eyes.
So you said violence, and I think I'm just chafing against that word, although I understand why you used it. And I guess I'm saying there's a necessity in chafing against these expectations and sort of figuring out somewhat laboriously which ones are going to be like, oh yeah, maybe it's a good idea to go to college, and which ones are like, no, I just can't do that.
But you make
but that's part of that's part of the heroic attitude that gets us out into the world in the first half of life.
It is. Your tone of your voice is very casual in a way that wrestling with these pressures for some people is agonizing. It feels absolutely agonizing.
But I think that really matters. I think that's the crux of the discernment about whether the protest, the suffering is genuine, has real authenticity, or when it has a note of artificiality. And that sense of feeling and knowing, sometimes we can see it in, let's say, a teenager, who may just decide, I'm not going to do certain things. I'm not going to comb my hair. I'm not going to wear shoes. And that it feels a little false. It feels a little precious. It feels a little...
Well, it may even feel sort of developmentally normal because that's kind of what teenagers do.
Exactly.
But then we don't want to privilege it too much.
Exactly. And that's a place that lacks a certain depth, a certain sense of coming from an authentic place, versus your issue of, I just don't think that I can do this, and suffering it a bit, and okay, I have to disappoint my father, and that has a price to be paid and is hurtful. And at the same time, I can't disappoint myself and be untrue to my true nature either. So somewhere there's going to be a real regret. And that's very different from, sort of the facile kind of protest of, I'm not going to do certain things. So,
in some sense, the meat of this topic may come up in a different developmental stage, more in sort of middle adulthood to midlife, when I think there's more differentiation being done, more individuation, more conscious often separating from the collective, deciding not to conform to collective norms. Maybe we decide to get divorced, or we change careers, or we do things that we might have not had the courage to do before. But as we live into ourselves more, we learn more who we are and what really matters to us. And more we learn we can't disappoint ourselves.
And these things are not polite moments. These are people fighting for their souls. It isn't tidy and neat. I think of somebody who was a minister who decided to investigate Jungian thought and had to go through enormous internal tensions, feeling that he was betraying God. to abandon some of the conservative evangelical creationist beliefs. And this was a point of agony, and on the other side of it, felt profoundly enriching. But this wasn't polite. This person was concerned that they were going to be damned.
Going to the hell, eternal.
There was a huge, there was a lot in the scale for this person.
So it's a real internal battle with suffering that goes along with it. It's not facile at all. And I'm thinking that the illustrative story here that you can tell, Joseph, is the story of Arjuna on the battlefield. That neither choice is easy.
No.
This is not an easy process.
And that
Everything
really
hangs in the balance.
It is a spiritual battle. And I think that's different with some of our fussiness with teenagers. It doesn't feel like a spiritual battle to ask your child to brush their teeth.
Right.
I mean, that's just really an exercise of will and autonomy, and they're flexing muscle to figure out that they can say no, and all kinds of other things. But it doesn't feel like, it's something to do with an awakening of their soul. And I totally understand that. So coming to the story of the particular story of Arjuna in the Mahabharata. So the entire Mahabharata, which is an enormous epic, it's kind of the size of the Encyclopedia Britannica, the incredible iterations of stories and myths. But at one point, that the god Vishnu incarnates onto the planet because the world has come into such a great imbalance that there's a threat that the world will not sustain, and that light itself, spiritual light, the light of consciousness, will be extinguished. He incarnates as a young prince and befriends a family of brothers. His best friend is Arjuna, who is said to be the perfect warrior. And through their various adventures and their process, they finally come to this pivotal moment where the forces of light, being led and inspired by Krishna, are on one side of a massive battlefield, and on the other side are the forces of darkness, which include Arjuna's stepbrothers, his uncle, his cousins, family members, his tribe. The rest of his tribe is on the other side of the battlefield. And as Krishna says, it's time. We have to fight this battle. It's your dharma. It's your destiny to do it. Arjuna freezes. And he says that as I look across the battlefield, I cannot raise a weapon against my uncle, my beloved uncle. I'm not going to do it. So he is in the tribalism. He is in the pressure to conform and the personal affections and attachments and all those things. And so Krishna guides Arjuna to the center of the battlefield, and they sit down, and he unfolds, which is now widely known as the Bhagavad Gita, which is a way that Krishna explains the nature of the universe and the nature of the self, and provides this clarity of truth that Arjuna is able to feel and know that his primary allegiance is to the self, which is embodied in the form of Krishna, and that the other attachments, the social experiences, environments, the memories, the pressure to be part of his tribe, are not where his allegiance lay. He is able to rise up and fulfill his destiny, which is to fight on the side of the sustaining of life. And at the end of the Mahabharata, just by a narrow margin, apparently, Krishna wins. The five brothers do succeed in the battle, and light continues on for another age. And I think that it's a tremendously instructive and realistic depiction.
That there's the necessity for real struggle that comes at a great cost to really live out our individual destiny.
And that the individual must go through a tremendous purification process to be able to acknowledge what they have been in allegiance to be able to clearly have a sense of the true nature of themselves, and finally to make a choice with, what will you serve in this life, and will you pay those costs?
What you serve, and the price that must be paid of forfeiting family attachments and loyalties, history, caring, for the sake of something deeper or more meaningful. It is a real internal psychic battle. It's not something that's easy. And of course, there's the obvious parallel in Christianity for when Jesus says that I haven't come to bring peace. I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword, and I will turn various family members against one another, a man against his father, a daughter against his mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. That this seems to be a real
That's a
deep
real
human
image of differentiation.
Yes.
It seems to me that what we're really talking about at this point is individuation.
We are talking about that, although the title of our podcast is The Pressure to Conform, and really acknowledging the incredible multidimensional way in which all forms of groups communicate to their members what is required to conform and to receive the safety of being part of the tribe, and how powerful that is, perhaps how necessary it is to be able to survive, but also how seductive it is, and how at some point, like Arjuna, it must be surrendered in service to at least the values that do not agree with the tribe, that allow you to actually bring something new into life, to incarnate, that the tribe couldn't have anticipated or expected.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've touched on this before, but there are people who are part of a tribe, say, and who receive the benefits of being part of that and the sense of safety and belonging. And it's pretty a-okay. There's not much conflict around it. And so they don't kind of come to the Arjuna on the battlefield moment, and maybe they never really separate. And, we might say that person perhaps didn't have an individuation opportunity, but it seems to me that that is something that happens. And
it's a tragedy that, we can say that it does happen, and perhaps it's a norm, but is that okay? Do we feel so neutral about it, that that's the state of the world? I think part of Jung's effort to advance his ideas, to publish, to create an institute, to lecture broadly, is that he wanted to ring a bell and put a spotlight on this phenomena and say, let's not be satisfied with that. Yes, it's part of the human condition.
I don't think he created the institute, by the way. I think he was somewhat opposed to the creation of an institute.
But I think what maybe you're hinting at here is, can we be lazy?
Yes, that's a good word for it.
Instead of engaging in a more rigorous and courageous confrontation with values, with ourselves, with other people, and what do we really stand for? Where is the meaning in our life? And I could also imagine that for some number of people, life may not create the circumstances where a person has to confront something. It may be a good fit, that my life unfolds easily, and I have a place, and I have no severe enough conflicts with other people, with my tribe, with my own self, that I am called to have to take this differentiating stand where I stand against, like Arjuna, my uncles and my cousins and my stepbrothers.
But are you actually saying that outer circumstances cause individuation?
I think it's sort of an epiphenomenon, right? I think that sometimes an outer circumstance can kindle an individuating experience in the psyche. Sometimes it has to do with sort of chafing against something where we're kind of required to differentiate who we are and what matters to us.
But I would still posit that the reason it's chafing is because there is an internal force that is causing you to recognize you are at odds with the circumstance, even though the circumstance may have not changed for 20 years.
Yeah.
That it is not circumstances that cause the individuating impulse. It is something inside.
It's both. We don't just individuate all on our own.
Can't individuate on a mountaintop, Jung said.
Exactly. And so, sure, it's interactions and chafing and the interplay of my horizontal axis of relationships and interpersonal conflicts with what resonates inside ourselves. I think it's a both and.
But, Joseph, you were saying sort of, is it okay? Is it okay if we just give in to the pressure to conform, for example? And I think one answer to that potentially is that I wonder if we're not living in a kind of new situation now in our world, where it really matters that we're able to take an individual stance, a sort of carefully thought out, carefully discerned stance of our own, where we're not just espousing tribal values, where we're really able to own our own darkness and not simply project it out as we often do when we're in a sort of tribal situation. And in fact, it may be that individuation is really important for the survival of our species.
Absolutely. And Jung's vision, apocalyptic visions towards the end of his life, that the planet was heading in a really dangerous direction. And his feeling was that the manifestation of the self in individuals was the only hope, that the culture could not save us from what was churning in this kind of collective field.
Which is why we value the individuation process, that each of us matters, and the level of awareness, differentiation, individuation that we can work with ourselves and others to grow into actually matters to the collective.
Yeah, and Jung said that, sort of every person who does his or her own work kind of adds a drop to the bucket of increase of consciousness or something.
Yeah, absolutely, he said that, and this is a very mystical idea that there is a world soul, there is an anima mundi, and that life needs human beings to wake up, to be as awake as they can, and to become centers of these individual expressions of self, and that feeds back into the anima mundi and changes her and, in a sense, redeems her.
Yeah, so by doing our own work, we help redeem the world.
And he didn't think that was a metaphor. He felt that very literally.
So I think this may be a place where we can come to a stop on a topic that I think we've really wrestled with, and that is exactly the kind of process that does take place. We wrestle with it, with each other, with ourselves, all of it.
So today's dream, it comes from a female dreamer who is 45 years old, and she is a teaching assistant. And here's the dream. A recurring dream I have had for years. I am in someone else's house and unable to find my way to my bedroom to sleep. I open doors and wander corridors. There are other people around. Sometimes I find my room to find it other people in my bed. Sometimes the house is a holiday cottage or a university hall of residence or a hotel or a huge rambling house. I never find a place to sleep.
Oh my goodness.
And I'll just share a little bit of context. She, as for context about the dream, sort of what's going on when you had the dream, she says, stuck in a job where I'm rather overqualified. And as for what were the main feelings in the dream, anxiety and sometimes curiosity. And as for the question of, does anything require a bit more explanation? She says, I moved houses a lot as a child and in my 20s. Houses turn up a lot in dreams, don't they?
Yes. And she is not in her own house. She's in someone else's house.
Yeah, and the different variations, most of them are sort of temporary or transitory. So like a holiday cottage, a university hall, or a hotel, or places that you might stay for just a little while.
Yes.
But that you wouldn't sort of settle.
So I'm thinking about what is a house and what is sleep. I think a house is sort of psyche writ a little larger, of this is my home.
Well, I actually think of it as perhaps, in some cases, a reasonably good outpicturing of the ego complex. This is where I live. This is a structure that I have built, that I inhabit.
You don't think it can also be an image of something larger in the psyche, of the unconscious, and a container for...
Yeah, I mean, obviously it sort of goes down into that, doesn't it? But it is sort of, houses are man-made. There's something that there are things that are constructed. So it's not superficial. But it's, and they have roots in the earth, right? And they have basements that are dug into the ground. But
I think we're talking about the archetype of home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And isn't it John White's book, Signs and Cemeteries of Belonging, the Irish analyst, that the archetype of home is really enormous.
Yes.
And having somewhere to belong and someone to belong to, which is so interesting given we were talking about tribalism and the pressure to conform. But on the other side of it, the positive polarity is that when we conform to the tribe, we belong to someone and we belong somewhere. And there is a deep drive to belong and to have someplace to lay one's head. And when I think about the bedroom, particularly, there's something very special about the bedroom where it's safe enough to go unconscious.
And that's where we have intimate relationships, and that's where we dream.
It's also where we rest, where we can put down the hurry-scurry of the day, the pressures, the stresses, the busyness, and relax. I think I'm just paraphrasing what you've said, of go into the unconscious where it's safe.
And that because the home and the bedroom have not constellated, she cannot find a place to sleep. So there's a way in which she comes into the bedroom, there's other people there, and then there is a feeling that I cannot fall asleep here. Some people might. Some people might say, get out or move over. I'm laying down. I'm exhausted. I'm going to fall asleep anywhere. But she won't fall asleep in the dream until she finds the right place to fall asleep, is my feeling.
Well, until she finds a place, where she either belongs or she feels safe.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to have a home of one's own? To not be in somebody else's house or in these somewhat temporary and collective residences of a holiday cottage or a university dormitory, a hotel. What does it mean psychically to have a home of one's own?
It's funny. It's a little synchronistic, I think, that we picked this dream for this podcast topic, which wasn't on purpose. But I'm thinking, if you have a home of your own, you have your own stance in the world. And if you're sort of living in transitory collective housing places like hotels or college dormitories, you are sort of wafted around from one collective to another without maybe having ever achieved an individual stance.
Yeah, they're collective structures, which might be a call to differentiate from those collectives. Your university dormitory, the hotel, or a huge rambling house, which feels sort of like an image of diffuseness instead of something that is well-structured and containing.
And of course, this is always, it's someone else's house.
Which makes her a stranger, or at least an outsider.
A wanderer,
She's moving
a guest.
around.
Yeah, she said that her feelings in this dream are anxiety and sometimes curiosity. So there must be a sense of kind of possibility that exists in these structures. But I think I'm feeling a little sad as we talk about this dream. I think it would be sad not to ever find a place to rest.
Absolutely. I think she is in a suffering state. And if we could imagine ourselves looking to find a place to sleep, being exhausted, this traveling from place to place.
Wandering through hallways,
I'm thinking about that image of the wanderer, and in the ring cycle, Wotan is the wanderer. There's an old rock and roll song, 'cause I'm the wanderer, yes, I'm the wanderer, da da dee da 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 da. So there's something about not being able to stop, to rest, to settle. It's a very evocative image.
It's poignant.
Yeah.
If she were in my office, I would ask her, how would you know if you had found your bedroom and a place where you could sleep?
And it might
That's
be
a
an
good question.
interesting act of imagination to invite her to imagine her bedroom, to create an image that has some specificity to it. Of the walls would be painted this color, and it would be this kind of a bed. And I'd also have a place where I could read, whatever that might be. But to start to think about what would a room of my own look like? What do I need?
Yeah, that would be a real interesting and probably profoundly effective calling it up in the imagination. I think that can really move psychic energy to do that.
Absolutely. I think it's the theory that we have archetypes which are ultimately unknowable, but we also have archetypal images, and those are things that we can imagine. And so it's like creating a funnel that from that archetypal image and our own imagining, we can bring it in and embody it in our own selves. And so it kind of comes down to earth and enables us to have a dream, which can become a goal, which can become a way to make it happen.
I'm aware that I'm curious about the other people around, especially the ones in her bed. And I would be curious about what she knows about these other people in her bed. Are they specific people? I would be really curious about that, because my sense is that these are other psychic contents that are kind of crowding her psyche. So the ego just doesn't have very much room, right? There's other things going on. Perhaps we could imagine that they might be complexes that are kind of crowding her out. So she must be contending with some kind of inner forces that make it hard for her to find her own stance again.
And I'm thinking about how Jung said that the psyche is a multiplicity. So as we think we're all one human being, but we have lots of different parts that kind of have lives of their own, the complexes. And so here some of those other parts of herself are sort of like Goldilocks, who's sleeping in my bed. And I want to know, who is sleeping in your bed?
Inspired by our earlier talk and the fact that she's in these collective environments, universities and hotels, I would wonder about collective values that are crowding her in the psyche, that she's trying to separate herself from and to find peace in her own room, where whatever is telling her to do this or that isn't constantly chirping in her mind.
That sounds right to me.
As we finish up today, I'd like to just offer a resource. I had erroneously said the author of the book I'd mentioned was John White. It's actually John Hill, and it's At Home in the World, Sounds and Symmetries of Belonging. I'd certainly recommend that book to our listener, and we'll put that link on the podcast. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.